Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Tuesday topic. We've got a couple folks here in the room and some folks joining us online and some more folks still joining us. While we're waiting for everyone to get in here for today's Ethically Speaking, Responsible Authorship and Publication with our presenter today, Claire Miller. All right. So without further ado, Claire, take it away. All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Darren. Okay, so today we're going to talk about authorship. There are lots of different sort of pieces and parts to that. Hopefully we'll be able to hear from some of you online and in the room if you have any experiences related to this that you'd like to talk about and share with the group. And then we'll also take a look at a couple of case study examples to get us thinking a little bit more deeply about authorship and why all of this matters. But I think these are three big pieces as to why authorship matters. So it's the way that credit for the work in that publication is assigned to the people who are listed as the authors. But more than that, it also tells us that those people are responsible for that work and the content of that work, and they also are accountable for that work. And then the third big piece is that it tells us that all of those people listed as an author or co-author have made major contributions intellectually to that paper or publication as well. Not specifically stated here, but getting that credit and demonstrating your intellectual contributions to the field could be really important in terms of a career path. And so whether that's as a doctoral student starting to establish an area within your field where you're looking to make your contributions and show that you're developing that expertise, or whether you're a faculty member, maybe you're looking to receive tenure, and so your publication and your intellectual contributions to the field are a really important part of that tenure and promotion consideration as well. Authorship for us in this room and listening into this room is an important feature of the things that we do. So to provide guidelines or guardrails for this process, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors has published a set of guidelines. Come in, have a seat. A set of guidelines related to authorship, and they outline 4 specific individual criteria, and that authors meet all 4 of these to be considered to meet the bar, the threshold for being an author on a publication. So the first one, I think, is the one we all think about, and that I sort of mentioned on the previous slide, is that you've made substantial contributions to either the concept, the design, the data acquisition, the data analysis, data interpretation, one or more of those pieces. And so that's your intellectual contribution to the content. But more than that, the ICMJE also is suggesting that you need to be involved, if not in actually writing some parts of the publication, but providing critical revision, so providing meaningful feedback that becomes part of the intellectual contribution into that publication. All of the authors give final approval for the version to be published because you're going to be accountable and responsible for what's written in that publication. So that's important that you've actually seen that final version before it gets sent away for publication or for review for publication. So all 4 of these pieces are outlined as needing to be met to be included specifically as an author on a publication. So just at this juncture, your first impressions, does that seem like a lot? Does it seem reasonable? Was there something else that you thought might be considered important? Is there one or more of these that actually you hadn't really considered before as being a necessary step to be included as an author? Anybody have any thoughts sort of off the bat here?
Folks online, you can turn your microphone on and join us, or you can drop your question in the chat.
Yeah, please feel free to just speak up. Okay, so no initial comments. So let's get into this a little bit more deeply. So according to those guidelines, to be an author, you'll meet all 4 of those criteria. The guidelines also go a little further with this, and this relates to we're starting to touch on things that might relate to potential issues in terms of authorship that we'll get into a little bit later. But if you meet the first criterion, which is having that intellectual input into the content of the publication, then the guidelines suggest that whoever's responsible for that publication as the primary author should give those people who made that intellectual contribution the opportunity to do the other three things, to contribute to the writing and revision, and to approve the final version and so on, and not to exclude them from that potential to meet the criteria for authorship should they be interested in doing so. So that's a little bit explicit to say that if you've made an intellectual contribution, that you do have the opportunity to become an author if you're willing to do the additional work that's needed there. There's always a corresponding author who is identified when the article gets submitted to a journal. And so they, as the name suggests, will be the one communicating back and forth with the journal. But oftentimes the co-authors have to, depending on the specific journal, you may also have to complete some online paperwork relating to your agreement to the content of the article and that you agree to be an author and all of that. Sometimes that's still on paper, which gets uploaded. Sometimes the corresponding author is allowed by the journal to speak for all of the other authors. So there's some variation there. One other thing that is important, and especially in relation to that career aspect that I mentioned at the start, is the order of authorship. So if there's more than one author, which they most often is, then there's an order that has to be determined. I think it's pretty much universally accepted that the person who is the first author is the one who did the bulk of writing that specific manuscript. And that's not always the same thing as doing the bulk of the data collection or data processing for the whole overall study, because there may be multiple manuscripts coming out from a large study. And so the first author is the one who has done the largest contribution to that specific manuscript. In terms of the order, after establishing who the first author is, there's a little bit of variation, I think, among different fields in terms of what's the next most important position. And maybe we could hear some examples from different fields, but in my field, which is, I guess you could say, health science or rehabilitation science, exercise and sports science, human movement, it's generally recognized that the last author is considered to be the senior author. So typically that's the person, so if a student is writing the paper and they're the first author because they're taking responsibility for most of that writing piece, then I usually would look to the last author to see who's potentially their advisor or the person who is responsible for that overall project. But I know in some other fields, the second position right behind the first author is considered to be the next most senior author. And then depending on how many authors you have in between, the in-between slots don't have a specific recognition, but generally speaking, the order would be from those making the next largest contribution would be second or third, and then through fourth, fifth, or whatever it is till you get to the last author. So for me, if I'm not the primary author, but I've been highly involved in the project, and the project's coming out of my lab, then generally I'd be looking to have that last author position. Sometimes I might take the second author position. Has anybody had any experience of publications where you've been in different positions in authorship? I'm not sure how many publications people have in the room at this point. Anybody have any insights or examples?
I would say, hi, this is Zach.
Thanks, Zach.
I would say I've been on a couple publications and pretty much followed the same structure that you use. I have noticed that there are sometimes publications that have fewer authors and some that have a lot of authors. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on publications when there's like 10 to 20 authors listed.
Yeah, that's really a good question. So in terms of how many authors, there could be like a whole sports team worth of authors on the publication. Generally, I think up to maybe a half dozen or so sort of represents the work. So like in my group, for example, we're a fairly small lab. So we might just have two authors, so maybe a student and then me as their advisor. We may have maybe 3 or 4 authors for a project that has more people involved. But for some really large research groups doing really big studies, especially if they have some sort of seminal work coming out, and it's taken multiple years to get to that point, I think that's when you can start to see that you get these really long author blocks. Or also another example I could think of is in the case of guidelines related to a profession, so like maybe clinical guidelines in a physical therapy profession, that many experts have contributed their expertise, and really that paper is sort of to represent the state of the field on that particular guideline or topic or recommendation or standard. Then you might also start to see a pretty long list. So I think generally that would reflect the magnitude and the amount of effort in terms of people and time and resources that have gone into that type of paper. Yeah, for sure. Good question. Okay. Let's see. So we mentioned the 4 guidelines, and to be an author, the expectation is that you have done all 4 of those. But maybe you haven't actually done all 4. Maybe you're involved in data collection, but then you haven't been involved in writing the paper. So there's an opportunity to have an acknowledgement section, which goes at the end of a paper. And so in that, you can specifically name and thank people who have made contributions that aided the success of what you're reporting in the paper, but did not have that same overall magnitude of contribution. And for example, let me think. In a systematic review paper that I published a couple of years ago with my group, we had the assistance of a librarian, one of Drexel's librarians, to help us set up the initial search. It's pretty complex to set up a really comprehensive search where you're trying to gather all of the relevant articles across your whole subfield for a systematic review. And so she gave us some really good guidance to help us get set up with that part, but then she wasn't involved further in the project. And so we included an acknowledgement thanking her and recognizing that important contribution that she made in the beginning of our systematic review process. But importantly, if you think you'd like to give someone acknowledgement, you should definitely always ask them if they want that, because that also means that they're going to be associated with your publication. And of course, we hope that people like to be associated with our work, but people may have individual reasons why they prefer not to be acknowledged or recognized for that. And so it's important to sort of just check in and get that confirmation. Some, but not all journals will actually ask you to provide confirmation that someone has agreed to receive an acknowledgement. But this is definitely a way to recognize the efforts of people who have helped on a small scale to the success of that project. And I think wherever we have the opportunity to do that, and a person would like that we should remember to make acknowledgements. So a more recent feature of publication, and Darren mentioned we're going to have some sessions about this next term, is the use of AI. And so journals are starting to update their guidelines for authors to ask for this to be declared. And occasionally, but maybe more and more, you'll read articles where there's an acknowledgement somewhere within there, or maybe in the methods, that AI was used for some aspect of generating that publication. So I guess emerging guidelines for the use of AI with journals seem to fall along these types of lines, so that you cannot list AI as a co-author. And if you think back to the 4 criteria, the AI engine that maybe generated some text is not able to be responsible and accountable for the content that's published. So it can never meet the criteria for being an author. And so, of course, regardless of the contribution that comes from using AI to help with some aspect of maybe methodologically or writing the content of the manuscript, the authors, human authors, are of course fully responsible for all of the aspects of what's included in that paper. So anything that's generated for you, of course, you have to make sure to check that for any hallucinations or other things that AI may sometimes do. So I think this is an emerging area where more guidelines potentially will be generated in relation to what people are how people are able to use that assistance. So talk a bit more specifically about Drexel and CNHP policies. Drexel actually has a responsible conduct of research toolkit on the Office of Research website in their compliance section, and this provides some additional guidance for us as Drexel researchers. So for example, they have a template available for an authorship agreement, and they have some guidelines related to changes in authorship and, heaven forbid, disagreements in authorship and potential for mediation should that be necessary. I would definitely suggest that the more you can do upfront, right at the start when you're thinking about what publications will be coming out of your study, that you have conversations very early on in terms of potential publications, who you think might be appropriate to be involved as authors, and not to sort of ride on that assumption, but actually to have specific conversations. People may have very different ideas from you in terms of what their contribution is going to be, and maybe even what they need to do to meet the threshold for authorship. And of course, we have the guidelines that we can refer back to in terms of how much someone needs to do to be included as an author. But there definitely is the potential for things to go astray, and that can lead to, confusion at best, maybe, hard feelings, if people have differences of opinion, and potentially larger disagreements. So it may seem a little bit awkward to bring that up early on, sort of, I feel like, but also it's really important. And not to sort of just make the assumption that you'll be writing the paper and the other people, it'll just sort of get figured out. So I think it's a good approach to do that. I think it also helps people to understand from the start that they will be making these major intellectual contributions to the project, but also to that specific manuscript. So it's quite likely, if you have a fairly large number of people on an overall project, that they won't meet that level, that threshold to meet all 4 parts of the guidelines for every single paper coming out of that project. And so I think it's important to have conversations about that. And yeah, it really can't be too soon, I think. Specifically for CNHP, the CNHP has a set of policies that largely reflect the guidelines, but I did just want to pull out the things specific to students and student research. And the college policies for that. The college does indicate that starting this discussion should come from the faculty mentor, and then to let students know about the policies, and then also have that conversation about individual projects. So often this is relating to a master's thesis or a doctoral dissertation. And as you might expect, the student whose dissertation or thesis that is has done most, if not all, parts of the intellectual idea generation, forming the specifics of the project, the data collection protocol, collecting the data, recruiting people, getting the IRB approval, processing the data, running the statistics, all of the things. And so naturally, the student will be the first author on the manuscripts, because also they're going to take do the majority of the writing of that manuscript. And especially, I don't know if this is the same in every program, but in our program, it's common for students to write their chapters as individual manuscripts. So they've already drafted manuscripts that then will be submitted for publication after their defense. And so in this case, if you wrote it and included it in your dissertation, then you're the first author. You've clearly written the majority of that. In terms of co-authors for dissertations, master's thesis, so you will have a committee members of your committee, including your major advisor. Typically, your major advisor is the person who's also had a large intellectual contribution, the conversations you've had with them, the feedback they've given you, the assistance they've given you in developing your ideas into the project that takes shape. So in those cases, then usually you're going to see your advisor in that senior author position. And then there could also have been other students who helped you with parts of your project. And then there are committee members who will have provided a greater or lesser amount of intellectual input into your project in terms of your proposal defense, feedback there, your document, feedback there, your final defense, and feedback on that overall final document. So those are intellectual contributions that committee members usually make. Depending on the specifics, they may have had more input into particular parts of your project. Maybe they're a biostatistician and they had a really large amount of input into the how you were setting up your statistical analysis or something like that. So there's a lot of variation in terms of committee members and their roles. But I think it's probably worth saying that just because someone's on your committee doesn't automatically get them a spot in your author list. But that it does give them the opportunity for that because they're providing you with the intellectual input. And then if they are willing and interested in providing the critical feedback into the written document. So now we've got 2 out of the 3, and then the responsibility. What's the fourth one I'm forgetting? The responsibility for the content and the other thing. What's the fourth thing? I forget, but what is it?
Final approval.
Oh, the final approval. Thanks, sir. So again, I think that's a conversation to have with your committee members as well. Sometimes maybe it's committee members may think that just being on your committee is enough. Guidelines suggest that their contribution, just like all co-authors, should raise to this higher level. And especially because they're taking responsibility for the content. So as a person being considered as a co-author, I think that's important to look at from the side of deciding whether to be a co-author on a paper or not is, are you confident in standing behind the content of that? Do you know enough about what was done in this project? Do you understand enough about the results and their interpretation for you to say that you can be responsible for the integrity of that content? And so I think that's a question to ask yourself if you're asked to be a co-author, is if you're comfortable with all of those aspects as well. And sometimes you may decide to say no. You may decide that perhaps you just don't have enough understanding and insight of this particular topic, and you don't feel totally comfortable that you're able to provide those kind of guarantees and responsibilities for the content. And you may decide to say, I appreciate you asking me, but I'm going to pass on this one. So that's always your option. The second part is not considering your major work while you're here at Drexel, but often you'll have the opportunity to assist with other lab projects, either your advisor's projects that you might work on as a research assistant, or other students that you might work together with on a project. And so if you are contributing some of your time, so maybe helping out with data collections, maybe crunching some numbers as part of your assistantship, then you wouldn't necessarily have authorship unless, again, you were able to generate a significant intellectual contribution and then also have that involvement in the review and writing and critical revision of the content, and again, provide those same guarantees. Often students are involved on these other more peripheral projects than their main project. And so I think if you felt that you are starting to make major contributions to one of these other projects, that it would be a good idea to talk with your advisor or the PI that's running that project and just let them know your interest. of, I'm really involved with this, I'm starting to learn a lot, I want to be able to contribute. Is there an opportunity for me to have sufficient involvement to make this substantial contribution? If there was, I'd be really interested in being considered to become more involved and then to be able to be considered as a co-author. So also, I think something worth specifically bringing that up, and don't sort of make the assumption that, well, they can see how much time I'm putting in, they can see I'm so interested. Just, make that known, and then you can have that conversation early in the process, and then they can give you their thoughts on it, and then you can go from there. And potentially it can be another area where you may be able to be a co-author and have another publication. So in terms of where things can go astray, there are kind of two opposite ends of the spectrum. I guess one is what is known as gift authorship. So meaning we'll include you as a co-author, but it's a gift because you didn't actually do all of the things that you should do to be included as a co-author. And one of our case studies will get into this in a lot more detail, but that can be a tricky thing to navigate in terms of different assumptions, especially depending on who that person is. It's making the assumption that they'll be included as an author, and you may not agree with their interpretation. But we'll talk a lot more about that in the case study. And then the other one is ghost authorship, or really just leaving people out who did make all of those substantial contributions, but for whatever reason, they are left off from the authorship list, and so they don't get any credit, they don't get any external recognition for that contribution that they made. So obviously, this is undesirable as well. So we are going to talk more about these, but as I already mentioned, to try to avoid running into disputes later, it's always good to talk about things earlier. And then in terms of where in the list you might appear, as you talk to people and as you get more familiar with the specifics of your field, then you'll start to get an understanding of which spot is the right spot for you to be within that list. So does anybody have any thoughts or questions or feedback related to sort of the things that we've talked about up to this point?
There was a comment from Dahlia in the chat, which you can't see because it's not up on the
Okay.
regarding nutrition, I assume, because Dahlia's a nutrition student. My group focuses on authorship based on contribution to the project, i.e. first author made the most contribution, second to last made the least contribution, with the mentor or senior author as the last author.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that sounds quite similar to what we see in our field as well. All right, good. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about some theoretical examples here. So it's written up, it goes over 2 slides, pretty long setup, but I'll also read out the scenario for the case study, and then a series of questions just to help us think about this and have a discussion about what our different thoughts and perspectives are in terms of the situation and how we might approach dealing with it. So Anna has a PhD from an American state university, and she specializes in the study of pain. She was trained in Taiwan, but she thinks in English, and English is her third language. So she has some difficulty in writing scientific papers in the appropriate and nuanced English. So she typically asks colleagues to review and to help to edit her writing. So she's recently taken a postdoctoral fellowship at an institution that has a strong publish or perish culture. Researchers flaunt their publication record, and they look down on anyone who does not have as many published papers as they do. It sounds like a great place to work. Anna enjoys giving people ideas and supporting people. And in return, she sometimes will ask for their help with writing and is happy to acknowledge their assistance in her papers in the acknowledgement list. But when colleagues return her manuscripts, they put their names into the list of authors, and Anna is stunned. Seems like they feel entitled to do this. So she does feel that others are taking advantage of her, but she refuses to change. She says her goal is to be a good scientist and not to fight over who gets to be an author of her work. She feels blessed with the opportunity to work on some of the most intellectually exciting projects, and she would never do anything to jeopardize this opportunity. Yeah, Anna is upset when her boss not only puts his name on her work, but also takes a research proposal she's prepared for funding by NIH and sends it off under his name without even discussing it with her. She mentions it to him, and he has the audacity to look at her as though she were crazy. Some administrators within the institution have seen the way people take her intellectual property and are sufficiently disgusted and urge Anna to think about ways to stop people from stealing her work. Fortunately, they have no power to intervene directly. Anna is unsure about what recourse she has. She values the opportunity to share ideas with others and get their responses, and is unwilling to do anything that will cut off that rich intellectual interaction. The theft of her ideas seems a minor price to pay for her scholarly environment. What should she do? So let's start off thinking about this. So it sounds horrendous. So it's a pretty extreme example, I think. I hope nobody has ever or will ever experience this. But what do we think might be some of the reasons why her peers and her superiors or boss choose to exploit her in this way or someone in this way? What are some of the power differentials that might be going on here? What are your thoughts?